Does anyone here speak German? Anybody at all? Margaret Thistlewood's heels cracked against the tile like gunshots, her phone pressed so hard against her ear. It left a mark. Nobody answered. Not the agency, not the embassy line, not the 3 translators she'd already burned through that morning. The German pharmaceutical delegation was packing up their folders in the boardroom upstairs. And the merger that would save 400 jobs at Halverson Pharmaceuticals was 20 minutes from collapsing on a Tuesday afternoon in February. A voice came from behind the cleaning cart, parked against the wall. "I speak German. I can help." Margaret turned. The woman behind the cart was maybe 65. Gray hair pulled back tight, a faded company polo with a coffee stain on the collar that hadn't come out in the wash. Her name tag said Florence in letters half worn away. "Are you serious right now?" Margaret's voice cracked into something ugly. "You push a mop around this building. Look at your shoes. You think you're going to walk into a room with men who control half the insulin supply in Europe and just talk?" Florence didn't move. She just stood there with her rag still in her hand, and something in her face didn't flinch the way Margaret expected it to. "Get back to the 3rd floor before I call someone." Florence lowered her eyes and wheeled the cart away. The lead negotiator from Dusseldorf walked past her a minute later, briefcase already in hand, headed for the elevator bank. Margaret watched him go and felt her stomach drop straight through the floor. But Florence wasn't finished. She caught up to him at the elevator and said 4 words, quiet, in German. He stopped. He turned around slowly, like a man who hadn't expected to hear his own language spoken correctly inside this building all day. What did she say to him? "We'll get there. But first you need to understand what happened 6 hours earlier. Because none of this makes sense until you know where Florence Whitcomb actually came from and what she'd been carrying around in a canvas tote bag for the better part of 40 years. 6:15 that morning, before the sun was even fully up over the parking structure, Florence was restocking the supply closet on the 2nd floor, when she heard voices through the propped door of the small conference room. The German delegation had arrived a day early for a preliminary site walkthrough, something nobody had told housekeeping about. Which meant Florence was standing 3 feet away with an armful of paper towels while 2 companies decided the fate of a 100-year-old pharmaceutical plant. A young interpreter, maybe 30, nervous sweat showing through his shirt, stood between the lead negotiator and Halverson's CFO. The German man, silver-haired, precise, the kind of man who chose every word like it cost him something, was raising concerns about manufacturing oversight after the acquisition closed. Who would control quality control? Who would have the final word if something went wrong on the production line? It was the question that decides whether a deal lives or dies. When the interpreter spoke, his English came out soft and round, almost apologetic, a vague comment about ongoing collaborative discussions. Florence's hands went still around the paper towels. That was not what the man had said. Not even close. She knew because she'd spent 4 decades with German rattling around in her head. Ever since she was 19 years old and fell in love with a soldier named Heinrich Vogel stationed at Fort Bragg, who used to write her letters half in English and half in German because he said some feelings didn't translate right. He died in a car accident before they ever married, before she ever set foot in his country, and the only thing she had left of him was a stack of letters in a shoebox and a language she taught herself afterward, word by word, because it was the last place she could still hear his voice. She set the paper towels down. She said nothing. She picked her cart back up and pushed it down the hall, the wheel that always squeaked doing exactly that, squeaking the whole length of the corridor. At 9:30 on her break, Florence sat alone in the break room, with a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm, earbuds in, not listening to music but to a German news podcast she'd downloaded the night before. The kind that moved fast and used real vocabulary, not the slowed-down lessons for beginners. She had a little spiral notebook she carried everywhere, the cover soft and rounded from being carried in a bag for years, and she wrote things in it during her break the way another woman might write a grocery list. Idioms. Phrases from Heinrich's letters she'd never quite let herself forget. A line he wrote once, translated in her own handwriting in the margin. Some things are only true in the language you first felt them in. Nobody in that building knew about the notebook. Nobody had ever asked Florence Whitcomb a single question about her life that didn't involve a mop. At 10 o'clock she was on the 4th floor, turning down a room for an early checkout, when she found a note left on the desk by a Swiss businessman who'd stayed there overnight, written hastily in German, asking the staff to please leave his window cracked because the room felt stale and he had a flight to catch and didn't have time to explain it twice. Florence read it without pausing, the way you read something in your own language, and she wrote back on hotel stationery, in clean handwriting, that the window would stay open and she hoped his flight was smooth. She signed it with her employee number. No name. She didn't know that the floor supervisor, a woman named Doris Calhoun, who'd worked at the company for 26 years and noticed things other people walked right past, had paused in the hallway and watched her write it. Doris didn't say anything that morning. She just remembered, now, to understand how a woman who'd spent 30 years cleaning offices ended up able to write a stranger a letter in flawless German. You have to go back further than that morning. You have to go back to a small house outside Greensboro, North Carolina, where Florence grew up, the daughter of a seamstress who worked from a back room and never once complained about the hours. Her mother used to say that a skill nobody could see was still a skill, and that the day would come when somebody finally looked. Florence held on to that, the way other people hold on to scripture. She met Heinrich at a USO dance when she was 19. And for 8 months they wrote each other letters nearly every week, his English clumsy and earnest. Hers slowly filling with German words she'd looked up at the library just so she could understand what he meant. When he died, she was 20. She didn't stop learning the language. If anything, she learned it harder, because it was the only place left where he still existed. She raised 2 children alone after a marriage that didn't last, worked the late shift at a hospital laundry for a decade. Then took the cleaning job at Halversolitz when her knees got too bad for the laundry floor. She kept learning German the whole time. Library books, free podcasts when smartphones came along, a night class at the community college that lasted 4 months until budget cuts shut it down. She tried once for a front desk administrative position at Halverson, something that would have let her sit instead of stand 12 hours a day. The application came back rejected within a week. The note read, "Position requires prior corporate communication experience." She folded that letter and put it in the back of her notebook. It was still there, all these years later. At 11:40 that morning, Florence was in the lobby wiping down the glass reception desk when a junior member of the German delegation, a younger man in his 30s, sat down on a bench nearby with his phone to his ear, agitated, talking fast to someone back in Dusseldorf. He didn't lower his voice enough. He was saying that the interpreter kept softening Herr Brandt's concerns, that what should have sounded like serious objections kept coming out sounding like minor scheduling questions, that Brandt was losing patience and might walk before lunch. Florence's rag slowed on the glass. She understood every word of it. It confirmed exactly what she'd overheard at 6 that morning. A second delegate approached and asked the younger one in German where the restroom was. Before Florence could stop herself, she answered, calm, clear, perfect, pointing down the hall. 4 seconds. That was all it took. Both men froze. The younger one lowered his phone and stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Then, almost under his breath, he asked his colleague if the cleaning woman had really just spoken to them in German. Florence didn't wait around for an answer. She picked up her cleaning supplies and walked away, heart hammering under her uniform, face composed like nothing had happened. The younger delegate watched her go, then immediately made another phone call. Not the one to Dusseldorf this time. He called Herr Brandt directly upstairs. You might think 4 seconds of directions to a bathroom doesn't matter in a deal worth this much money. But in negotiations like these, trust is the only currency that counts, And trust starts the moment someone believes they've actually been understood. That 4-second sentence told two men, for the first time all day, that someone inside this building spoke their language. Not just the words, but the meaning underneath them. After hours of being smoothed over and softened, that feeling was worth more than any spreadsheet on the table. Upstairs, in a private waiting room, Herr Brandt listened to his colleague's account with his arms folded. His expression didn't change much. But something in his eyes did. Florence had no idea any of this was happening. At 12:15, Margaret Thistlewood was crossing the lobby, adjusting a flower arrangement when she saw it. Florence standing near the front desk, actually talking, to two members of the German delegation. And they were nodding, relaxed, more at ease with her than they'd looked with anyone from Halverson's team all morning. Margaret's stomach turned to ice. This wasn't pride. This was fear. She crossed the lobby in long strides and didn't wait for the men to step away first. She did it right there, in front of the front desk staff, in front of a bellman, in front of two guests checking in. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" They asked me a question. I just what? Decided you're a translator now because you picked up a few phrases somewhere. You think you can walk up to clients worth more than this entire company and start chatting like you belong in that conversation? Florence said nothing. Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping into something quieter and far more cutting than yelling would have been. "Let's be very clear. You clean. That's the job. That's the entire job. You are not qualified to speak to anyone above the second floor, and you are absolutely not qualified to open your mouth around people worth more than you will make in your lifetime. If I see you anywhere near this delegation again, I will make sure you never clean another office in this town." She turned on her heel and walked off, blazer snapping behind her. Nobody in the lobby said a word. A guest lowered his newspaper, frowned, and said nothing either. Florence stood still for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Yes, ma'am," and walked to the service elevator. The doors closed behind her, and that was when she broke. Not loudly. She leaned against the metal wall, hands shaking, and thought about her mother's voice, the one that used to say a skill nobody could see was still a skill. This time the words didn't land the way they used to. She pulled out her notebook, flipped to the back page, where the old rejection letter still sat folded, and beneath it she wrote 3 words in her own handwriting. "Maybe she's right." Meanwhile, 3 floors up, the CFO sat reviewing the interpreter's translation summaries against his own notes from the meeting, and felt something not add up. The tone felt wrong, diluted somehow. He noted it mentally and moved on to the next fire. He shouldn't have. At 12:40, Florence walked into the small business center to empty a recycling bin and found a stack of papers left forgotten on the printer tray. The English-language draft of the acquisition agreement. She shouldn't have read it. She read it anyway, in under 2 minutes, and found the exact clause Brandt had been pushing back on that morning. The English draft said joint oversight, shared authority over manufacturing standards, a genuine partnership. The version the interpreter had been communicating all morning suggested something much closer to full operational control, transferring entirely to Halverson's side, with the German company simply supplying capital. 2 different deals on the same table, and neither side knew it. Brandt wasn't being difficult. He was reacting correctly to a contract that in his own language told him he was giving up everything. Florence put the papers back, exactly where she found them. She picked up the recycling bin and walked 3 steps into the hallway and stopped. She could say something. But who would listen? Margaret had just promised to end her career over 4 seconds of directions. She kept walking, chose silence, not out of weakness, but because she'd been knocked down too many times in her life to believe speaking up would change a single thing. She was sitting alone in the break room, notebook closed in front of her, when Doris Calhoun appeared in the doorway. Doris had been looking for her for 15 minutes. She sat down across from Florence without being asked. "The gentleman in 412. The one who left the German note this morning." He called down to ask who wrote the reply. Said the handwriting was lovely, asked for the person by name. Florence looked up. I gave him yours. Nobody in all her years at Halverson had ever asked for her by name. Doris's eyes drifted to the notebook on the table, the edge of a page just visible, German phrases crowding the margin. How long have you been speaking German? Florence didn't answer right away. But something in her shifted, because Doris was the first person all day who'd asked instead of ordered. She told her everything. The mistranslation that morning, the manufacturing clause, the interpreter softening every hard edge until two companies were negotiating two different futures without realizing it. Doris listened without interrupting. Then she said, "You need to tell Mr. Halloran." Florence shook her head. Mrs. Thistlewood made herself very clear. Florence. Doris's voice was calm, but it didn't bend. I've worked in this building 26 years. Walter Halloran is the only executive I've ever seen who actually listens when someone tells him the truth. If what you know is real, and I believe it is, he will hear you out. She leaned forward. Margaret can fire you for speaking up, but if you stay quiet, you're going to fire yourself a little, every single day for the rest of your life. Florence looked down at her notebook, at the 3 words she'd written 20 minutes earlier. She picked up her pen and drew one line straight through them. She didn't write anything to replace them. She just closed the notebook and stood up.
Which floor is Mr. Halloran's office on?
Doris smiled, the first real smile of the whole story. 5th floor, end of the hall. I'm coming with you. At 1:50, 10 minutes before the 2 o'clock meeting, they reached the 5th floor. Walter Halloran's assistant stood immediately, blocking the door. He's preparing for the 2 o'clock. No walk-ins right now. Doris didn't move. She has information that matters to this deal. I've worked here 26 years. I'm vouching for her personally. The assistant looked between them, Doris steady and unmoving, Florence in her uniform with the cart parked down the hall, and stepped aside. Doris stayed at the threshold. She nodded once at Florence. Go. Florence walked in alone. Walter looked up from his desk, pen still in hand. He didn't ask why a cleaning woman was standing in his office. He set the pen down and waited. Florence spoke fast, clear, no wasted words. She laid out the mistranslation, the manufacturing clause, the gap between the English draft and what the German side had actually been told. She explained that Brandt wasn't being unreasonable. He was reacting logically to a contract that, in his language, demanded he hand over everything. Walter turned his laptop toward her and pointed to a paragraph in the German translation. What does this say? Florence translated it on the spot, fluent, exact, every clause in place. Walter sat back, studied her for a long moment, then picked up his phone and revoked the interpreter's credentials for the rest of the afternoon. He stood, came around the desk, and looked her directly in the eye. I need to ask you something, and I need a real answer. If I bring you into that room, in front of the board, in front of a man who controls half the insulin manufacturing on a continent, and something goes wrong, if you mistranslate one word and this deal collapses, that's 400 jobs gone, on your name. Are you prepared to carry that? The office went quiet except for the hum of the air vent. Florence didn't look at the floor. She held his gaze. Yes, one word, no conditions. Walter held her eyes a moment longer and the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. Good, because if you'd said anything else I wouldn't have believed you could actually do it. He walked out beside her. Not in front, not behind. He didn't ask her to change out of her uniform. She walked into that hallway exactly as she was, because what she carried was never about the clothes. The hallway to the boardroom was long, marble underfoot, the kind of space built to make people feel important. Walter's leather shoes clicked steady against the floor. Florence's soles, worn thin, made almost no sound at all, except for the faint squeak of the one wheel on the cart she'd left behind, still ringing somehow in her ears. My father swept floors at a textile mill in Gastonia for 30 years, Walter said, eyes forward. Knew everybody on that floor. Their kids' names, their worries, everything. People talked to him because nobody else was listening. Florence said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, My mother used to say the same thing about the houses she sewed for. The ones who do the close work always know people best. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. At 2 o'clock they pushed through the boardroom doors. Long table, floor-to-ceiling windows, the German delegation seated on one side with Brandt at the far end, arms crossed, jaw tight, a man who had already made up his mind. Margaret Thistlewood sat near the head of the table, spine rigid, every head turned. Margaret shot to her feet, chair scraping. "Walter, what is this? She's a custodian. I gave her a direct order to stay away from, Margaret." Walter's voice was flat, final. "Sit down or leave the room. Pick one." Dead silence. She sat. Brandt rose. He spoke fast, every sentence sharper than the last, listing every place he'd felt his concerns get softened and smoothed over until they meant nothing. He finished with 4 words. "We are leaving." He reached for his briefcase. Florence stepped forward. She didn't wait to be introduced. She looked directly at Brandt and spoke in German, fluent, calm, unwavering, and repeated his own concerns back to him, word for word, exactly as he'd said them that morning, proving without question that she'd understood every syllable. His hand stopped on the briefcase. She explained the clause. The English version, joint oversight. The interpreted version, full transfer. 2 deals on the same table, neither side aware. Then she said the line that changed the room. "You were never being deceived. You were being mistranslated. Those are not the same thing." Brandt looked at her, really looked, past the uniform, past the worn shoes, and slowly set the briefcase down. "Who taught you to speak like this?" "A man named Heinrich, a long time ago, and a library, after he was gone." Silence settled over the table, the kind that follows something true. "Continue," Brandt said. For the next 40 minutes Florence served as interpreter, not just of words but of meaning, smoothing what needed smoothing without losing the edge of what mattered, finding the English shape of a German idiom so both sides could actually feel it. The tension in the room thinned. By the end, Brandt asked to speak privately with Walter, and as the room cleared, he raised a hand toward Florence. "Not you. Stay." Alone with the 2 of them, his voice slower now, Brandt said the deal would move forward, the terms corrected, and he had one condition. He looked at Florence, not Walter. "She is the liaison. Not offered, named. She handles every communication between our teams through the entire transition. No exceptions." Walter didn't hesitate. He nodded once, then turned and shook Florence's hand, not as employer to employee, but as one professional to another. When the doors opened, the hallway outside was packed. Staff, executives, people who'd heard whispers and drifted closer. Walter stepped out first and said, loud enough for everyone, "I want this on record. Today's deal was saved by Florence Whitcomb, an employee this company nearly overlooked entirely. That failure belongs to us, not to her." Brandt stepped forward and gave a small, deliberate bow, a gesture that in his culture carried more weight than any handshake. Then it started, one by one. A board member crossed the hall and pressed his card into her hand. "Call my office Monday." The younger delegate from the lobby shook her hand and held it a beat too long. "I knew it. The second you spoke, I knew." At the far end of the hallway, Doris Calhoun stood with both hands gripping the counter, tears sliding down her face without apology. 26 years of being reliable and unseen, and this one moment made all of it worth something. Margaret was asked to stay behind after the crowd cleared. Nobody heard what was said in that room, but 2 weeks later she was no longer director of guest relations. No scene, no announcement. Quietly moved to an administrative post at a satellite office an hour outside the city. Fluorescent lights, no view, no delegation ever walking through. The official record cited conduct issues. Everyone in the building knew the real reason. Her last week, she had to walk past Florence's new office every day on her way to the parking garage. A brass plate at eye level, Florence Whitcomb, Cultural and Linguistic Liaison, impossible to avoid. On her final day, carrying a box down the hall, she passed Florence going the other way. 3 seconds of silence. Florence spoke first, no bitterness in it. "I hope things go well for you, Margaret." Margaret didn't answer. She adjusted the box and walked on, heels clicking faster, then fading. That evening, alone in her new office, Florence opened the notebook to the back page, the old rejection letter still folded there. Beneath it, 3 words with 1 line through them. She framed both, side by side, and hung them on the wall next to her name plate. Not out of bitterness. To remember that the real danger was never being underestimated. It was believing the people who underestimated her. 6 months later, she completed a certification in international business mediation, paid for in full by the company. Brandt invited her to Frankfurt to work directly with the transition team. Her first time ever on an airplane. At 66 years old, after a lifetime of teaching herself a language from library books and a dead man's letters before the world ever gave her the chance to use it, she turned down 3 corporate job offers that followed. She wasn't interested in a seat at someone else's table anymore. She started her own consulting practice and named it after her mother. The seamstress who told her a skill nobody could see was still a skill. She used part of the first year's earnings to fund a free language program at the public library, where she'd spent so many nights alone with a paperback dictionary, naming it after Heinrich, because some things deserve to outlive the person who started them. Doris Calhoun was promoted to Director of Guest Relations, the exact role Margaret once held. At the announcement, she stood in front of the staff and said 1 sentence. "I didn't discover Florence. I was just the first person who didn't look away." Margaret left the company entirely 4 months after her demotion. No goodbye, no announcement. Nobody noticed she was gone. There are millions of people in this country who carry an entire second language inside them and never once get asked. The average cost of a failed international deal over a cultural misunderstanding runs into the millions. The cost of simply asking the right person the right question is nothing at all. So, somewhere today, you will walk past someone you've already decided you understand. A man sweeping a parking lot, a woman behind a counter, someone old enough that you assume their best years are behind them. You won't see what's underneath the uniform unless you stop, unless you ask. That's all it ever takes. I think about Florence Whitcomb a lot, honestly. Not because her story is rare, but because it isn't. There is a version of her in nearly every building you've ever walked into, folding something, wiping something, waiting for someone to ask one real question. If you've ever been the person nobody looked twice at, or if you're the one who finally did the looking, tell me about it. I want to hear it. And if this reached you today, pass it on to somebody who needs reminding that it is never too late to be seen.